Do blessings from above, in fact, come from below? Now, when I initially started researching the socioeconomic class in relation to participation among individuals within a religious society, I pretty much already conjectured at the notion that the results would show that there is a high correlation between those whom are very actively religiously involved um, and a high difference between these individuals in relation to other groups of people who were not religiously involved. And the reason as to why it was that I could already pretty much foresee the outcome and results of these experiments was, in my mind, merely common sense. I mean, you have group support, you have friendship, you have community relationships which form, which allow you to interconnect you and your lifestyle with other individuals, which allow you to have a much more successful life. And in your worship, you actually participate in a way which regulates moral and ethical behaviors. And due to the fact that society itself, in most regards, rewards people in which they think deserve the reward, and the notion of deserving something falls into relation with them being morally and ethically astute in relation to the rest of society itself. So it's kind of like this reinforcing group which reinforces their own beliefs, and by doing so allows this group to become much more successful than groups outside of the group itself. And what is actually going on here is that by them worshiping what it is that they perceive to be God, they in essence are actually manifesting what the ancient texts already tell us God is, and that is pretty much the collective intelligence of all things. And people in groups and participating groups in ritualistic behaviors definitely fall into this collective intelligence. And so I found three very interesting studies which show the relationship between religious individuals, mortality rates, socioeconomic status, and religious individuals, and also being very non-conservative in regards to sexual activities. And what I found here is some contradictory notions which give us very odd but very interesting notions in regards to the human character, the human being, our innate psychology, and what all of this actually means when we actually apply it to the world today. We can see how there are hate groups that are formed because they don't necessarily agree with a lot of the beliefs which are passed around in these organizations. But then what happens is these organizations themselves become very successful because they not only obey the laws of the land, but they obey further laws which don't contradict the laws of the land, but in a sense actually lead them to being able to achieve a much higher standing within life because they're restricting the behaviors in which they can morally and ethically participate in more so than the individuals not within this group, which leads to them being more financially successful, leads to them having higher ages, a lower mortality rate, and interestingly enough, even though a higher socioeconomic status itself, disregarding religion, actually leads to studies showing more promiscuous sexual intercourse and activities among the species, what we actually find is that as soon as we introduce religion into the model and into the actual experiment itself, we find that no longer do we see the relationship showing itself between the socioeconomic status and promiscuous sex. as soon as we add the barrier of this moral and ethical behaviors among the society and these groups of individuals that worship, and in a sense, they're kind of worshiping their own company. And it's just this whole reinforced structure that's like this grand, immense temple that's actually built up of the immense bodies of all the individuals within the organization itself. And they kind of carry one another to the top, so to speak. And it's really funny because then you find that there are a lot of hate groups which form. For example, a lot of hate groups form around a lot of religious individuals because in a lot of regards, they're actually some of the most successful individuals, and they pull a lot of the strings behind what you see on the screen itself. They're not necessarily the attention seekers because, a lot of their principles come through ideals and notions of humility and being humble. So they don't necessarily seek power, but by them not seeking power, they actually gain power. And they're the ones that are kind of pulling all the strings and writing the script behind the scenes that you don't necessarily see. And it's funny because then a lot of hate groups show up and they're like, whoa, there are all these like people that are kind of controlling a lot of our day-to-day lives. Well, yeah, they found themselves in this position because they regulate their carnal selves a lot more than other individuals do who criticize these groups. So in a way, these groups that criticize these religious groups are actually hindering their ability to, in a way, capitalize on everything that they criticize these groups for actually having and achieved themselves. And so, truly, are the blessings themselves from above, or are they actually from below? And are they from, in actuality, the people that participate in the ceremonies? Is God really sprinkling blessings upon the chosen people who, in a sense, actually worship God, and they have the notion of what God really is correct? Or, in a sense, is it merely the belief system in which these people hold and the behaviors and activities that they participate in which actually allow them to sustain a much more moral and much more sensible way of life, which allows them to maintain a higher integrity and structure within these organizations and social groups, which allow them to thrive much more than individuals who don't necessarily participate in these groups themselves? And in actuality, is this in reality God itself? Merely, the collective and the good intentions and the vibrations and energies in which a collective group can actually form an organism, and this organism itself can in fact have good intentions, not only for those within the organism, but for entities outside of the organization itself. And in this sense, do we actually find the description and the definition through translation of these ancient texts actually describing the manifestation of the living God actually being an actuality in reality here upon the face of the planet today? So, are these people merely forming an entity on another dimensional plane? And what I mean by that is that, companies and corporations actually form living entities as soon as they actually have defined their structure and their purpose. So this is the next dimension of an entity in relation to the dimension of the human body. It's actually an organism built up and organized and functions through the cooperative use of human bodies, then forming an organism and a structure much larger and much more capable of influencing the planet and other entities and things beyond time itself, more so than just a single entity or an individual. So, are these people blessing themselves, or is there actually something outside of the circle in which we perceive to be universal existence in our capabilities of viewing an interacting hand among society that actually, in a way, manipulates the world that is, how it was, and the world in which we perceive today? The world may never know, because it's kind of hard to, in a sense, beat the one who actually, let's say, made the game, so to speak, or to reveal, it's kind of like what I like to compare it to, this whole notion of God, or actually discovering as such, is relatable to, in a way, let's say you're playing a computer game against the computer. And it's funny because the game itself, if it was self-aware that it could, and would have possible reward over beating you, the one who wasn't necessarily composed of the game, could in fact demolish you every single time without, second glance, due to the fact that you yourself are placing yourself in this game, and what you're playing against could literally know all information as to the whereabouts of your position and all of your actions. And so it's almost like the game itself is set up for you to win no matter what, because obviously the game could just destroy all things as quickly as they came about without hesitation, because the game itself has to be aware of all your positions and all your information and interactions, which, the game has to limit itself for your performance. It's kind of like that within this whole game of the universe. It's like we live in such a competitive era, and it's so hard to not necessarily strive to try to gain and attain this power for ourselves to, in a way, fulfill the need for success, which has been driven into our skulls since birth, where, I have to outcompete Bob over there, otherwise Bob's going to take my place, and I won't necessarily be able to have the things which I enjoy doing because I won't be able to afford them. And it's this fine balance between respecting all other individuals, yet at the same time understanding that you yourself are in a competition with all individuals. And, everybody's trying to build up their mountain, but gravity's trying to pull it all down. And so you're not only competing against everybody else, but you're competing against the universe and God itself, because, the universe can't necessarily play favorites. And when we actually look at the living organism that is the planet itself, and we see everything for the intelligence that everything itself houses, is it really beneficial for one tiny cell within your human body to take advantage of all the resources and capabilities within the body itself? Not necessarily, because what we actually call that is cancer, where something, breaks within the cell cycle and it continually replicates and takes over and forms tumors, and it actually requires much more energy than it demands, I should say, much more energy from your body than it actually requires or is a necessity. And we see that in relation to our day-to-day lives, where people become kind of like acting cancers upon the living organism that is the collective groups of people that form communities themselves. Whereas through this whole competitive scheme of things, they've actually been able to outmaneuver everybody else, and in a sense are then demanding much more than they actually themselves require. And it's kind of ironic because everybody wants to be on the other end of that spectrum, but they themselves hate everybody else on the other end of that spectrum. So it's like as soon as you achieve that, you would pretty much, because you hated them before, you would be a hypocrite because you yourself then became that exact same thing which you then hated. You know, and then we can say, well, people in these positions can become acting beneficiaries for good intentions rather than evil motivations, which we actually see becoming realities within the world itself. People really do, from day-to-day lives, really scoff at the notion that, you know, there are these evil organizations, and the fact that money itself can drive people to do some pretty corrupt things really should be, you know, the kind of alarm clock to wake you up that, yeah, you really do have to question a lot of things that you read and take to be the blunt truth in the news that you receive. I mean, there are a lot of people lobbying for things which they utilize to, you know, manipulate the markets and to maintain their grasp on the markets. But then again, we have to like look at ourselves and ask ourselves the question, if we were in that position to maintain power for ourselves and to maintain a higher standard of living than the rest of the 99.9% of the population, how would we ourselves act in this situation? Would we become lights upon the world and actually become purveyors of truth and be able to restrain ourselves from certain actions or policies or deals that would in effect actually diminish our powers, but would be for the greater good and for good intentions of the rest of the intelligences that reside within the universe itself? Or would we say, no, I've been given this opportunity, this chance, I've worked, scraped hard, and I'm going to do whatever it takes, regardless of any moral or ethical borders or boundaries that I myself may breach. And whether you like it or not, you will probably be confronted by this issue some point in your life where you have to take all these things into consideration. And just remember, many things in life are not necessarily so much as what you can do, but is much more so in what you should or shouldn't do. All right, everybody. Thanks for joining me on another journey through my mind, and hoping and wishing that I was able to convey a lot of the messages and information in a way which was able to be understood. Well, thanks for joining me on Euphoric Intentions, and until next time.